It was a cool autumn evening in 1992. An LL Boeing 747 lifted off from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, bound for Tel Aviv. However, minutes later, people on the ground were jolted by a loud bang. Looking up, they saw flashes near the right wing and debris falling from the aircraft. Something was terribly wrong, but the flight was far from over. On the 4th of October 1992, LL Flight 1862 departed JFK International Airport in New York, bound for Amsterdam, with an onward leg to Tel Aviv. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, the aircraft was a 13-year-old Boeing 747-200 freighter with over 45,000 flight hours and more than 10,000 flight cycles. The flight across the Atlantic was largely uneventful. However, several technical anomalies were noted. Fluctuations in the autopilot speed regulation and some minor radio problems. More concerning though, voltage fluctuations in the electrical generator on the number 3 engine on the inner right wing. However, the issue was managed and was not of major concern to the pilots. At around 2:40 p.m, LL Flight 1862 landed at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport and was captured here by an aircraft enthusiast. The aircraft was refueled and readied for its final leg to Tel Aviv and would have a crew change. The captain for the final leg was 59-year-old Yitzhak Fuchs. He had more than 25,000 flight hours, including over 9,500 on the Boeing 747. The first officer was 32-year-old Arnon Ohad, with just over 4,000 hours. The flight engineer was 61-year-old Jedediah Sofa, who had more than 26,000 flight hours, making him the most experienced crew member on board. There was also one passenger, a 23-year-old LL employee, traveling to Tel Aviv for a wedding. At around 6:22 p.m, Flight 1862 took off from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport for the final leg to Tel Aviv. Once airborne, they made a turn to the right, and for the first 5 minutes, the climb appeared uneventful. However, at around 6:27 p.m, roughly 5 minutes after takeoff, fishermen on Lake Goema, near Amsterdam, were startled by a loud bang. Looking up, they saw a brief flash on the aircraft's right wing, then 2 large objects falling from the sky. Meanwhile, back on the 747, the pilots noticed that all power was lost to the number 3 engine closest to the fuselage on the right wing. Seconds later, the number 4 engine too. On a Boeing 747, the engines closest to the fuselage are not visible, while those on the outer wing are difficult to see even in good conditions. So, while they knew they'd lost power to number 3 and 4 engines, they weren't sure why. The first officer declared a mayday, informed air traffic control, and requested to return to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. The Boeing 747 can safely fly on 2 engines, so at this stage, as far as the crew were concerned, they would be safely on the ground soon. However, a tailwind on the first approach left them too high and too fast. The crew of Flight 1862 abandoned the landing and would go around for a second try. Shortly before 6:35 p.m, 13 minutes since takeoff, the pilots of Flight 1862 attempted a second approach for landing, this time slower and at a more favourable altitude. It was at the moment they extended the flaps, however, that their aircraft made a sudden and violent roll to the right. The first officer radioed air traffic control, going down, going down. Locked in an uncontrollable roll, the aircraft banked sharply, almost 90 degrees to the right. At 18:35 and 42 seconds, LL Flight 1862 nosedived into a high-rise apartment building in the Belmer district of Amsterdam. All 4 people on board, and at least 43 people on the ground, were killed. On the ground, the scene was absolute carnage. 2 police officers in the area, responding to a burglary, witnessed the crash and raised the alarm. The impact triggered an explosion, fire ripped through apartment buildings, and large sections collapsed inwards. 11 floors were engulfed and dozens of apartments were destroyed. Many residents escaped through different parts of the building, while others were seen jumping from windows to escape the flames. The investigation into the tragedy was conducted by the Netherlands Aviation Safety Board. In the days following the crash, pressure to recover victims led to the rapid removal of the debris. Large sections of wreckage were transported away from the crash site, complicating the investigation. Investigators were left to search through the debris dumped at the landfill. The flight data recorder was recovered, but the flight deck voice recorder was never found, despite LL stating one had been installed. But, more notably, both engines from the right side wing were missing. The logical next step for investigators was to interview the fishermen on Lake Goima who witnessed the aircraft in distress. They described seeing 2 large objects falling, and investigators believed these were the missing engines. Divers were deployed to the lake, and both engines from the right wing were recovered, as well as a 10-meter section from the right wing. One engine detaching during flight wasn't unheard of, but for 2 to fall from the same wing was highly unlikely. With the engines recovered, investigators focused on how they detached. The engines are mounted to a pylon, which is mounted to the wing, held in place by metal fuse pins. The Boeing 747 shared an almost identical pylon design with the Boeing 707. Investigators learned this particular design had a troubling history. In 1968, a Boeing 707 crashed after an engine fell off in flight. In 1991, a China Airlines 747 crashed in another rare incident where 2 engines detached after takeoff. There were other non-fatal incidents, but it appeared LL-1862 fit a worrying pattern. The next step was locating the missing fuse pins that held the engine and pylon to the wing. Miraculously, after an exhaustive search through a mountain of wreckage, investigators located the missing fuse pins. To their dismay, they discovered that one from the number 3 engine pylon was broken. What the broken pin revealed was unexpected. Instead of a clean break, as designed to do under an extreme load event, the pin showed signs of long-term metal fatigue, damage that had developed over years, long before Flight 1862 ever took off. But this raised a disturbing question. Even if the number 3 engine pylon and fuse pin had failed, it didn't explain why the number 4 engine had fallen off too. Now confident they knew the reason the number 3 engine detached, investigators turned their attention to the number 4 engine. There were no broken fuse pins, but a large dent, marked by a smear of paint on it, caught their attention. The paint was sent for testing, and when the results came back, investigators were shocked. The paint smear matched a paint sample from the number 3 engine. What this meant was clear. When the number 3 engine tore free, it had struck the number 4 engine, causing it to detach too. However, this still didn't explain the crash. The Boeing 747 can easily fly on 2 engines. Along with the 2 engines in the lake, investigators also recovered a 10-meter section of the leading edge of the right wing. This confirmed that when the engines broke away, they took part of the wing with them. The investigators concluded that, on final approach, when the pilots extended the flaps to generate lift at a lower speed, because the right side wing was damaged, only the left side flaps extended, creating a deadly imbalance. The left wing produced lift, while the right wing created drag, causing the aircraft to enter its final death roll to the right. In the wake of the findings, Boeing issued service directives to all 747 operators, ordering that engines and pylons be removed and inspected, and that fuse pins be checked for metal fatigue and replaced if necessary. In the years after the crash, residents and emergency responders reported ongoing health problems, including insomnia, respiratory infections, and chronic fatigue. For years, authorities maintained the aircraft had no dangerous cargo, and early health complaints were largely attributed to psychological trauma. That position changed, however, in 1998, when an El Al spokesperson acknowledged that the cargo had included 190 litres of DMMP, a chemical used to test detection equipment for nerve agents. Israeli officials and representatives insisted that the quantity involved was too small to be militarily useful and that the shipment had been legally declared. Even so, the delayed disclosure deepened public mistrust and ensured the controversy surrounding the disaster did not end with the crash. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. And as always, thanks for watching.